So, how do our negative emotions affect us physically? I say negative emotions in quotation marks because it is my belief that no emotion is better or worse than any other emotion. All emotions are valid and every single emotion has a purpose, and that purpose is generally communication. If I feel fear, typically the purpose of that is to trigger something within me to get myself into safety. Fear typically triggers the knowing that we're not necessarily safe or secure. Anger, for example, might mean that we need to change a behavior or change something in a relationship. And so every single emotion as we go through them has different purposes, and the purposes for me might be different than you. But ultimately, nothing is a negative emotion because it has a purpose, and that purpose, again, like I said, is communication. And at the end of the day, when we talk about emotional regulation, it's not about trying to control what we feel or change what we feel. It's about learning to respond to what we feel and learning to actually address what we're feeling and being in communication with these feelings and these emotions. And I'll chat a little bit more at the end about all of this, but I do teach an entire 6-week course all about the different emotions that we experience and how they affect the body specifically, with some practices and some tools that we can use to move through many of these emotions and to be in better communication with ourselves. But with all that preamble, it is important to understand that some emotions actually do feel worse than others in the body. And for that reason, we still use the word negative because sometimes they can have negative health outcomes if we're stuck in these cycles of emotional loops that are, in these more negative states, and they can actually have negative health consequences if they fester for too long. So, the big thing that we want to address is that it's important to be in communication with these emotions and to learn from them and adapt from them, and to not bottle them up or stifle them or to bypass them. And there is a slight difference between bottling them up or bypassing them, and I want to address that. So bottling up an emotion is letting it fester inside of us without actually addressing it or, communicating what we're feeling, expressing what we're feeling. It means it kind of just lives beneath the surface and bubbles and festers and snowballs until, maybe we have a complete big inappropriate outburst or something at some point. Bypassing, or you may have heard the word spiritual bypassing, is when we just pretend everything is totally fine and totally ignore what we're feeling. So, just looking at the bright side or, good vibes only. These things are actually really harmful because it completely invalidates what we're feeling. And, if we pretend everything is totally fine and we're in this peace and love and rainbow state, we're not actually addressing what's happening, and these emotions can still affect us negatively because they're still in there, and not addressing them and pretending they're not there can be extremely harmful, and it's invalidating and can create even more cycles of negative feedback and negative experiences. So it's important to address that. We never want to bypass emotions. We want to listen to them and be in communication with them, and then have tools to work through them, whatever that looks like to you. And that's going to be different person to person. My way of moving through an emotion might be different than someone else's. And, especially when it comes to really challenging working with a practitioner who's well-versed in all this is really, really important, especially someone who is trauma-informed if trauma is there. So what does it mean? When we are stuck in a negative thought loop or a negative emotional pattern and we're not able to break it, what happens, like we said, these emotions are triggers for something to be done. So if it's fear or anxiety or resentment or whatever, these things trigger a complex system in our nervous system that if the thing that we're angry about or the item that we're anxious about is not neutralized or it doesn't go away, then what happens is this can set off a reaction in our limbic system, which is our it's a series of connected areas of the brain that detect threat. They can then set off a sympathetic reaction in the autonomic nervous system, which can shift our body into a fight, flight, or even freeze mode. And this can activate the sympathetic vagal complex, or even the dorsal vagal complex, for those who are familiar with the polyvagal theory. There's another video on this channel about the polyvagal theory if anyone is interested in learning more about it. What this means is when we're in a sympathetic state or even a dorsal vagal state, that our body has shifted into a state where it is much more concerned with survival in the short term. Because if we have an immediate threat that we need to deal with, we're not concerned with thriving in the long term. We're concerned with neutralizing this threat. So if we're in a perpetual state of a specific emotional loop, and that threat's not going anywhere, then we're going to get stuck in this sympathetic or freeze mode. And then what happens is we need to do something about that threat in order for our body to shift back into long-term survival and even thriving. And so when we're stuck in sympathetic, then what happens is all of our resources are going towards systems that are going to help us neutralize this threat. So whether that's like fighting or running, or, even beyond that, freezing and just playing dead for survival. And when that happens, our cardiovascular system increases in activation. So our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, breathing goes up. We're stressing that cardiovascular system. And we also see our immune system get less attention, our digestive tract gets less blood flow, our reproductive function goes down. And as a result, as those systems have begun to shift, this can really stress the body. Something else that happens when we're in sympathetic is our muscle tension increases and our sensitivity to pain actually increases. So as we're stuck in these feedback loops, we're stuck in a more autonomic, sympathetic state. We're more prone to pain and muscle tension and high blood pressure and decreased digestion. We're going to have issues in the gut, low libido, and our immune function might go down. And so long term, you can see how these can be really serious on the body, and they can really affect our health. And ultimately, they create what we would call nervous system dysregulation. And tons and tons of taxing on the body's systems. And ultimately, many of the illnesses and chronic diseases that we're seeing now are diseases of stress and of dysregulation. So if we zoom back out, it's really, really important to address these negative emotional experiences that we're having. And like we said, there's lots and lots of ways to address these emotional loops. Working with a therapist, doing EMDR, cognitive behavioral therapy, neuro-linguistic reprogramming. There's tons and tons of ways of moving through these. And, just good stress management. So, getting good sleep and rest and all these things that are really, really important for stress management. But yeah, getting help where appropriate. It's really, really important to address these emotional loops, because as we see here, it can tax the physical body and create long-term stress issues. So with all that, I'd love to hear from you. What are your ways of managing, negative emotions? You can write your feedback down below. And like I said, I teach a 6-week program on learning to be in better communication with our bodies. It's called the SEA practice, SEA, Somatic Emotional Awareness. And it's all about learning to recognize the sensations that our body produces when we're experiencing certain emotions. So every week we go through a different emotion. We do different mind-body practices to begin to feel these specific emotions in the body, so that we can have a better awareness of when we're feeling these emotions, so that we can respond more appropriately to them. On top of that, there's some movement practices that are rooted in functional neurology, traditional Chinese medicine, that help us actually move meridians and muscles that are associated with the organs that hold specific emotions. In elemental traditional Chinese medicine, every organ is associated with a different emotion. And so we've drawn those concepts in and created some movement practices that are, helping us to move through certain emotions while we're developing an awareness around them. So if that's of interest to you, the link to the SEA practice is down below. I'd love to see you there. And in the meantime, I hope that this has been helpful for you to understand how our more negative emotions can affect us physically. Thanks a lot for listening.